All right, that puts us right at 3 o'clock. I'm not exactly known for being punctual, but I might as well do it today. So my name is Peter Chittum, and this is my talk to help share with you how if you can write a formula field, you can use a command line. It's as simple as that. I'm a developer evangelist. I'm based in Europe. I live in the UK. And I also lead the developer evangelist team in the EMEA region. So that's a little bit about me. I've been with Salesforce for almost 8 years, 7.5 years. This is our forward-looking statement. Please do not purchase any software based on any forward-looking statements that I may make. Make sure you make your decisions based on features and functionality that are currently generally available. Now, I conceived of the idea of this talk when Salesforce DX was about to go live, and I started thinking, who are the people out there using Salesforce today? We have a lot of developers, and we've never really asked the developers that use the core Salesforce platform to use command lines before. And we also have a lot of admins, and a lot of admins are very comfortable with point-and-click things, but they're not necessarily comfortable with writing code or things that look like code. And so I thought, why not just show people that actually using the command line is not that hard. So I really wrote this talk for any computer user. Who here is a computer user? Okay, well, that's good. I've got my demographic. Who wants to use the command line and maybe was feeling a little bit sheepish about getting started or not really sure where to start, right? So I thought, why not give a little bit of a primer and also relate it back to some concepts, hopefully, that you all understand in Salesforce, like functions and formulas. So who here has ever written a formula field? Pretty much everybody. That's great. So there you go. One thing I need to say ahead of time is I am using a Mac, and I would guess, even though most of Salesforce evangelists and most Salesforce people I know are using a Mac, that's probably not the predominant platform. However, the command line tool I'm going to be using is based on Bash, which is called Born Again Shell. And a shell is just a command line tool, basically, which now runs in any platform. So if you're running Windows 10, you can actually install a feature called Windows Subsystem for Linux, which allows you to run Bash. Now, I've actually recently upgraded to something called Z Shell, but it's just a derivative of Bash. So what I'm going to show you is pretty much the same as you can use in Windows, Mac, or Linux. Who here uses an operating system that is not Windows, Mac, or Linux? All right, good. So we're doing pretty good so far today. And I want to explode this myth that the command line is scary, because certainly if that's the first thing you ever see in the command line, it could look very scary. This is actually a command line utility called curl. It's a general purpose utility. And it looks very complex because it's general purpose, so you kind of have to tell it everything. This is actually a call against the Salesforce REST API to perform a SOCL query, which means if you're going to call Salesforce, you need to be authorized, so you need a user. You need to encode the URL. You need to know what the URL is. You need to make the query work in a URL, and then you get data back in JSON, which isn't necessarily easy to read. Okay, so this works, but if that's how you start, you might be a little bit daunted. On the other hand, let's look at something more simple. So imagine I have a text file called names.txt, and I need to get those names in an alphabetical order. And for the purposes of fitting on a slide, 4 is good. But let's say it's like 4,000, and I need to get these in alphabetical order. What might you be tempted to do? You might copy those names, paste them into Excel, and say, put those in order, right? That makes sense. On the other hand, with the command line, you can just type sort names.txt, and it will do the same thing for you. You didn't have to open Excel. You wrote fewer than 20 characters, hit enter, and you're off and running. So, if you're already working in the command line, if that's how you have adjusted your work to fit, you can do exactly the same thing, but actually with less effort, faster. So that's the quick thing I wanted to show you, and then jump right into a demo to kind of take that a step further. All right, here we go. Okay, so here I am, and if I show you what's, oops, let's clear that and go up to the top. So if I show you what's inside this particular folder in my file system, there it is, names.txt. And if I show you inside of that file, which I can do with something called cat, any cat people in the room? Oh, that's great, yeah, you'll love this talk. Names.txt. And you can see that those all have gone into order. Now, some of you may recognize those names up there. This was actually a real exercise that I did. This was for Dreamforce last year because I owned the sessions, and I needed to find out how many session owners I had. And I already had a list of names that I had exported from a report, and I didn't want to go back into Salesforce reports and create a new report just to count the names. So I thought, okay, well, all right, so I can do this. So let's do sort. Sort names.txt. And then, okay, it's getting easier to find out how many individual names there are. And I can take that a step further. So let me clear again. So it goes to the top, so clear. And then I can do, now if I hit up arrow, it'll go back to a previous command. That's called history. So sort names.txt, and then I'm going to use another command called unique, okay? So what that's done is it's taken that initial output, passed it to unique, and then if I do that one more time and I say, let's count those, there's a utility called WC, stands for word count. It counts more than words. I can actually have it count the lines, and now I know there were 20 session owners that I had to count, right? So it's a little bit more involved than just sort names.txt, but it's actually pretty straightforward to understand what I went through there because I had all the names, I got them in order, I was then able to make those unique, and then I could count those unique lines. And it's actually, it's not that hard, okay? So real life thing that I actually had to do, so let's move on, and I will get back to some of the details of what I did here so you can understand not just like, oh great, sort names.txt, well, that sorts names, Peter, thank you. That's not the end of the session. I want you to understand what's going on here. How is it that I've got these three commands, and how's the data getting from one command to another? Because when you start to understand that, then you start to understand the power of using the command line. All right, so let's go back here and go back up there. And off we go. So let's take a step back and actually define some terms. What is the command line? Command lines also sometimes called shells, and a command line is an app. That's all it is. It's an app. It's an app to run other apps. So those little commands that I did, like sort, unique, and WC, those are basically little mini apps that do one thing. Right? One of them sorts, the other one makes unique things, the other one counts things, okay? So that's it. So that's all that the command line is an app to run apps. Anyone ever used anything like that? That's basically it. So now how they actually work, and this is where the magic happens, is that we have data that's going to go into those apps. Some of that data could be streamed in, so imagine sort of, bits and bytes, on a wire going across from one command to the other, called streaming. Or it could be reading from a file. So when I did sort names.txt, that was reading from a file. But then I was able to stream that stuff to the other commands, obviously, and I'll show you exactly how that works. So this is where it starts to get actually kind of what you might be familiar with already. So if I have a function in a Salesforce formula called hour, and I pass a date into that, and then I get the number of the hour out of that, this is exactly how command line commands work, actually. So this is kind of where it came to me. Actually, all of these Salesforce administrators and developers who've been writing formula fields, they actually already know how command line commands work. They just don't know it yet. Okay? And it gets better. Because as you saw, I don't just run one command necessarily. I can actually string these commands one after the other after the other. And I can pass the data from one command to the next, to the next. And so how that works is I can have one command and then a semicolon and then another command, and that will make command 1 run and then command 2 run, okay? If I want to make sure command 2 only runs if there's an error on command 1, then I put double ampersand between them. So run the first one. If we don't get an error, then go ahead and run the second one, okay? And then the really cool one is called pipe. Who knew this was called a pipe symbol? Who knew it was called a pipe symbol because you're piping data from one command to the other? Cool. A few of you did, yeah. So that's what the pipe symbol does, is it says take the output from the first one and pipe it to the input of the next one. Okay? Now, believe it or not, you have already done this if you've written a complex formula field. Who here has ever written a formula like this? What does this formula do? This is the audience participation portion of the... Yeah, it takes the date, it extracts an hour value from that, and it converts it to text. That's exactly right. So, looks something like this. Or another way you could deconstruct that is kind of like this, where I have date, which is a field value. And that field value is passing through each of these functions almost like a little filter, right? So through the first filter, we come out and we've stripped out the date, and all we have is the time. And the next filter, we strip out just the hour value from that time. And then the next filter, convert that to text, and now we have the correct output for a text-based formula field. All right? So how is this not like the command line commands that I just showed you, right? Where I have data from some data source. It's then going to go through one formula or one function, through the next function, through the next function, and finally have an output. And if you take that same concept and you just substitute those arrows I put in there for the pipe symbol, you have sort of a representation of exactly how command line commands work. So if you've written a nested set of functions in a formula field, you've already done exactly what it takes to really take advantage of some of these very powerful command line commands that are very simple but powerful when you connect them together. Good so far? Okay, there's one last little tidbit that we have to talk about. That's parameters. Parameters allow us to change the way that commands work. So for instance, if my command was cook an egg, the parameter would be something like, well, I'm going to scramble it, boil it, fry it, make a quiche, a frittata, or whatever, right? So all of those things, that would be the parameter, but the function would be cook an egg, right? We don't want to create one separate function for make an omelet and another for boil an egg and another for all those other things. We want one function and then just tell it to do it in a different way, right? Okay. So if we go back to the demo now and we take a look at what that looked like, we can put some more context around what I was doing, right? So sort is getting data from names.txt, okay? And it puts all of those names, and there were duplicates, into alphabetical order. Because we're using pipe symbol, we pass that output to the input of unique, and that strips out all duplicates. We then pipe it one more time to WC, word count, but we use the L parameter to say, actually, let's just count the lines, not the words. And then we're done. We have our output of 20. Did anyone not get that? Anyone? Excellent. We're on our way. All right. So a couple of other things let's just talk about before we move on to the next bit of the demo. Now, sometimes you want the output from a command to actually be written into a file. And the way you do that is the redirect symbol. It's the greater than sign. So with redirect, you then identify a file name, and it will write to that file name. Now, redirect always overwrites, so you need to be a little bit careful here. If you want to append to the end, you do a double greater than, and then it's going to be. if you have an existing file and you don't want to completely overwrite it, then double greater than shape. Now, I want to do a whole bunch of things that are kind of around really basic manipulating the file system, because in the end, these command lines, these shells, are really just kind of a wrapper around the guts of what's going on in your computer. It's just, it's surfaced in a way that's text-based as opposed to clicking on buttons. So everything that you would normally do in something like Finder or Windows Explorer, File Explorer, you can actually do all of those in the command line as well. And I just kind of want to go through those and show them to kind of make those less mystical. Now, some of the names are kind of funny. They're usually abbreviations, and that just comes down to back in the day, they had to make things shorter because they didn't have a lot of data to work with. So if your command was shorter, you could do more things. That was kind of what it came down to. So cd, change directory, ls is to list files, etc. All right? So let's move on. Oops. Okay. Oh. All right. I want to escape out of that, because then it's usually happier when you come back. All right. So for this one, all I did was, so I have on the one side, Finder, right? So that's the file system user interface in my Mac. And on the other side, I'm just going to do some command line commands just to kind of show you, as I do these things in the command line, I want you to see the things as they're popping up on the right-hand side, see them appear and disappear and all that kind of fun stuff, okay? So first thing, I'm just going to go in and, I want to see what's inside this directory. So if I do ls, that's the list. If I want to see this represented in a different way, ls minus al actually gives me more details. And this is kind of the default way that most people say, show me what's in this particular folder here. And you can see that, on the right, you can see the same files that are represented on the left. On the left, though, there's a couple of extra things that show up. There's the dot, and the .ds store. The dot and the dot are sort of virtual folders. And the .ds store is a hidden file, so you don't see it in Finder unless you go and explicitly say to see it, okay? So what next? Right, let's make a new directory, mkdir. We'll call it demo2. And there you can see it over there, and then I'll go cd, change directory, demo2. Now, there's this cool feature where if I hit tab enough times, it's going to go and say, okay, well, there's that one there, and I'll hit enter, and enter again, and now it's moved me into the demo2 directory. And I know that. I'm just going to expand this here, so we'll see a file pop in there, because if I do touch file1, the file is going to pop up there, okay? And then I can always make that go away, rm file1, and then that's going to remove the file, okay? Now, Windows has some really fun things. So for example, there's this command called say. Oop. Oh, I thought I turned that off. All right. So I'm going to probably refrain from deleting stuff because that's going to be annoying. All right, so I can do something like say hello.
Hello.
Oh. That's kind of fun. So I can also actually spit the output right to the command line. So underneath, if I do echo, hello, so it spits it out there, right? And then, I can append those together with the semicolon, remember?
Hello.
Hello. Or I can just pipe that to say, I can take off that second hello, and then I can do echo hello, pipe say hello. Then it doesn't output, but that's fine. The next thing is, what if I want to actually write the output to a file, okay? So if I do echo hello, and then remember to write to a file, I do greater than, and so we'll call this hello.txt. Okay, you can see the file popped up there on the right. And if I want to append to that, I'm just going to go here. And by the way, every time I go back to a previous command that I've used, I'm just hitting the up arrow. That's a built-in feature with most shells to make it easier to get back to the stuff that you've seen or that you've done. So I'm just going to do this a bunch of times. There we go. And then I can do something like cat hello.txt, pipe that to say, oh, okay, that's going to get annoying. But we could actually do something like, are we in a happy mood or kind of a somber mood? Happy mood, that's where I'm at. Okay, so this should work. I thought it, oh, there we go. So you can actually like give it a different voice, you know? So anyway, yeah, okay. I'm sure you'll find practical use for that in your implementation of Salesforce in the very near future. Just one last thing. I mentioned history and how I'm kind of going back through that. If I want to see the history, I just type history, and I can see all the things that I just did. So if I did something and I wasn't sure what I did, it didn't work, I can just kind of go back through that pretty easily. All right, sound good so far? All right. And back to the slides. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few more powerful commands. Alias is a really cool one. So you can see that sometimes the commands can get a little bit long. Alias allows you to create a shortcut for that. So you can basically declare the alias, assign what the command is going to be, and then you type the short version, and you just have to, you get things a lot faster. So that's one thing. I've shown you cat already. That's one way to read a file. I know, I had to work her in, sorry. So cat is a way to read a file. It actually stands for concatenate. That's actually where it came from. So it's actually meant to sort of stick two text files together and then output both of whatever the combination of that thing is. But it is sort of the de facto way that most people who use the command line use to just sort of read the contents of a file. There's also head and tail. Head reads from the top, and tail reads from the bottom. So if you want something like the first 5 lines of a file, then you would use head. Or if you want the last 5 lines of a file, you would use tail. Or last 10 or 20 or whatever, right? You can also just open up tail on an output, and then as things are written to the file, it would just be spat out to your console. So it's pretty powerful that way. And I'm going to show you actually an implementation of tail that we've done for the Salesforce DX command line that's just been released pretty recently. So if you want to view your log files in your command line, you can actually use Salesforce DX to do that, as opposed to like go up and download the file or view it through Developer Console. You can just have a local copy of that. There's dog. Actually, I'm kidding. There isn't a dog. I just sort of put this in for the dog piece because I thought they might want that. Actually, the real reason I put this is to show alias. So you could say, I want cat to be dog. So you say dog equals cat, and you're good to go. And then you type dog, okay? So WC you already saw, as I said, stands for word count. And it counts other things besides words. So it does count lines, words, or characters. And I've actually used the character one a lot in my managing of sessions for Last Dreamforce and for Trailhead DX, because every once in a while somebody gives you the title of a talk that's more than 80 characters long, which is where we store the titles in the name field of a custom object in a Salesforce org. And I need to tell them how long it is so they can figure out how many characters to rip off that title. And I just do echo, and then I'll paste in the text of the title, and then I'll do WC minus C, and then I can find out exactly how many characters are without opening up a web page and finding whatever the utility du jour is to find out how many characters are in a string. So again, a little practical tip there. Now, the two I want to show you next, grep and sed. So grep stands for global regular expression print. This is basically a tool to go and find patterns in text. So you throw a text file at it, you say, here's a pattern to look for, and it'll spit out each line that matches that pattern. Now, if you take a tool like that, and you combine it with something called sed, which stands for stream editor, you have a very powerful find and replace tool that you can use on any text. So imagine, when was the last time you had to export a CSV file, make a change to a whole bunch of values in that CSV file, and then import it back to Salesforce? You can use these two commands, and you don't need to open up Excel again, right? And I'll show you sort of one version of that, a fun version now, and then I'm going to come back and show you a more real version of that a little bit later. Okay. So yeah, next demo. There we go. Okay, so here. So again, what's inside this directory? There's something called forwardlooking.txt. This sounds fun, doesn't it? Oh, so if I do cat forwardlooking.txt, you can see this is actually the forward-looking statement. And then I can do kind of fun things like, I can say cat forward. Actually, let's do like the first 5 lines. So head forwardlooking.txt. Oop, no, I need to do head. Oh, I'm totally forgetting this is why we have notes. -n, there we go. So head -n 5 forwardlooking.txt, and I can see the first 5 lines, right? I could do the same thing with tail. Okay, so tail. Okay, and then I could do something fun, like, the forward-looking statement's kind of long, so maybe we want an abridged version of that. Does it sound like a good thing? Because then so then you could say forward-looking, and then we'll say, write that to, let's call it the shorter-looking statement. txt. Okay, and then we can do the same thing with, okay, so we have to do tail, but we also need to make sure that we go over here and we don't, right, we want to make sure we append to the end, right? And now if I do cat shorter-looking.txt, it's a much more manageable forward-looking statement. Yeah, but I would have to say that it is not legally sanctioned by the legal department of Salesforce. So just to make that really clear. The other thing, so I wanted to show you grep and sed. So grep works like this. So if I do grep, and let's look for statement on forwardlooking.txt, you can see all the different places where the word statement have popped up. So each line with the word statement, I can see that. Now, so I can grep that and then say, let's use stream editor, sed, and what we'll do is we're going to substitute the word statement, let's see, for the word, what do you think? What should I use? Forward-looking bananas. Oh, singular. Forward-looking banana, yeah, and let's close that string, and then there we go. And just to make it so that we can see it better, if I do grep banana forward-looking dot. Oop, what did I do? Oh, that's because I don't want to do forward-looking. I just want to use the. There we go. So now you can see all the different. So the presentation may contain forward-looking bananas that involve risks, uncertainties, etc. Okay, so. Now, it's a silly example, but hopefully you can extrapolate a little bit and see where you could take this potentially with actual real text files, okay? Good. And let's move on. All right, so now probably some of you wanted to actually see the Salesforce DX CLI, yeah? So I want to spend a little bit of time showing that, but just really briefly, I want to introduce, why do we have this thing? What's the purpose of having a specific command line interface for Salesforce? Really what the command line interface is a tool so that you can access Salesforce's APIs, right? Now, the nice thing is if you're an administrator, accessing APIs in the past may have felt a little bit daunting. Even if you knew that there was an API, a REST API Explorer in the Workbench, you might have even gone and worked that Explorer a little bit, but in the end, it's not a real practical tool necessarily, unless you're a coder that's trying to figure out, like, what's the actual output from this API. And so the CLI, it actually gives you a very usable interface for getting to that API if you are not a developer, actually. And this is the main reason why I really want to see more administrators and Salesforce developers adopting the command line, because it really opens up the world for you, and I'll show you some examples. Remember this example from my earlier slide? And I said there was some, it's a great general purpose tool, this curl utility, but, I need to authorize, I need to know the URL, I need to encode the query on the URL, and I have user-unfriendly data. The command line interface for Salesforce can do the exact same thing, but it's a lot more friendly. Now, you may have been able to interpret that upper one, but I'd guarantee that everybody here can at least get a sense of what the lower one is doing at this point, right? The only thing that's a little funny is the -u parameter there. That's actually just an alias for the org that I'm using to make this request. So there's basically a placeholder name, and rather than having to know the username I'm connecting as, I can just use the placeholder name instead, okay? But all of those problems I said, I don't need to know the URL, I just need to know the query in a string format. The -u does my authorization for me, it's already done, and my data is coming out in a user-friendly format. So all of those things are, that is the purpose of a purpose-built command line utility as opposed to a general purpose command line utility, right? They're both powerful, but they really solve for different problems. All right, and that brings us to our last demo. All right, so what I'm going to do here, a big reason behind Salesforce DX is so that you can store your org's changes outside of your org and have those be the canonical version of what your org should be. So I'm going to actually get started with this by cloning a project using Git. And Git is, in my instance, I'm using a command line utility. You don't actually have to use Git in a command line. There are some really good GUI-based Git tools as well. I'm going to go ahead and use a command line since that's the subject here. So git clone sfdx dreamhouse, and I'm going to call the new repository tdx18. Okay, so that's going to clone that all locally. I'm actually cloning it from a local repository, so anybody who knows Git, like why didn't I pass in a URL for it? Because I didn't want to wait for all that stuff to download. That's all, okay? So now what am I going to do? I'm going to create an org. So sfdx force org create create -s says I want to store the default user in this repository so that I don't have to know the username. It's just going to automatically by default connect to it. -a is that alias, right? And I'll call this tdx18. And then -f is actually what is the definition file that says what kind of org will this be, right? So is it going to be a developer edition org, an enterprise edition org, etc. And so if I go to config, and why isn't that working? Thank you. It would help if I actually moved into the folder, tdx18. There we go. All right. Now let's try it. So sfdx force org create -s -a tdx18, and then -f config. And so I'll use the project scratch def. So that's going to be the thing that says this is what my org is going to look like. And I misspelled create. Thank you. I heard somebody saying that there. Thank you. All right. And we're off and running. So this goes out, and it does a couple of things. The first thing is it's actually going to create this scratch org. Scratch orgs are meant to be temporary workspaces so that we can very quickly create a place to work there, bring the changes down to the local directory again, and then destroy that thing when we're done. So we don't need to keep the org around. Like I've got developer edition orgs that are 8 years old now. And I don't really need them, but they're there because that's what I've always used. So the next thing is sfdx force source push. And this usually takes a little bit of time. What this is going to do is, So I cloned a repository that has the definition of, it's got some custom objects, it's got some Lightning components, it has a few other configurations, some process builder stuff. It has all of those things. Now remember, I set that org as the default, so I don't need to explicitly name it. It's just going to automatically connect back to that same org. And then it's going to take the metadata that was defined in that repository that I cloned and push it up there. So any moment now, it should finish that up. There we go. Next thing I need is to assign myself a permission set. So sfdx force user perm set assign and -n dreamhouse. The Dreamhouse one should be up there if I go and look for permission sets, just to make it, right? So there's Dreamhouse perm set right there. So that's where I got that from. It wasn't just out of thin air. That should take a moment. And then the last thing I need to do is actually put some data in the org. So sfdx force data tree import -p. And then I want to go to data, sample data plan.json. And there we go. So with pretty little effort, I have a brand new org. I have a user to use it. I've got some data in that org along with some custom functionality, and then I can go and start working with that. Now, the thing I wanted to show is to just jump right in and take that same concept that I showed you with grep and with sed and kind of take a look at what you could do with a real-life scenario. So sfdx force data sockle query -q select id name status from property C. Okay, now this is actually virtually the same query that I showed you earlier in the slide when I gave you that example, where I'm just doing a basic sockle query that says, go and get all of the records in this particular custom object. Okay, so I found 12 of those. What I want to do is get those nulls into like an actual data value that is meaningful. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I need to actually turn this to JSON. So I'm going to go back to a more machine-readable format. And the reason I want to do that is so I can parse it into a CSV file, because that's what I'm going to eventually upload. And the utility I'm using for that is called JSONV. It's a pretty straightforward, kind of quick and dirty JSON utility. Name status. And then I need to tell it where in that JSON it's going to be, which is result.records. And that should now take that and push it out into, so what I've done is I've transformed, it was perfectly good, it was human readable, but that's not data that I can really parse and do anything with it. So I transform it into what is now a CSV format. I'm going to then take that, and I need to put a header. There's no header on there right now, right? So next thing is to take that, pipe it one more time. And I actually have a header text file. It's a bit of a quick and bit of a messy way to do this, but it gets the job done. So cat data header.csv, and I'm going to concatenate that with what is actually being passed over the pipe, right? So from the pipe symbol, put the header first, concatenate on the end of that the CSV that I've created, right? And then, well, let's just see what that looks like. So the header goes straight away, and then once we come back from the server, we get the rest of it. And now I have a workable CSV, so what are we going to do next? We're going to take that, I'm going to redirect it and call it updates.csv. And then I'm going to turn right back around, and if there is no error, remember double ampersand, right? So if there is no error, then sfdx force data bulk upsert. What's the S object? Property. what is the file is my source, which is updates.csv. And then finally, what is the ID field, which is ID. All right. Now, if I got all that right, when this is done, I should have updated all of those records. So I pull out the data, transform it, turn it into CSV, write it to the file, and then append it or update it straight away. So I can go and check my status. It's actually giving me the command in Salesforce DX world to go and check the status of this bulk API call. And it says success. So I can actually go back and I can repeat my query. And I can see what came back out again. This is all in my Scratch org right now. Yeah. You could do this in a production org. I would really strongly urge you to not do exactly what I did, because what I've done is, like, what if I got one value wrong? I've now updated a whole bunch of records. So, but as sort of a nice flashy example of what you can do with a command line, right? Now, what I would say is if I was going to do this for real life, I would go as far as writing to the local CSV, and then I would open up Excel and look and see, does this look right? And then I could go forward with the actual bulk update. Yeah. I have exactly 1 minute and 14 seconds left. So what I'm going to do is actually take questions outside, because I want to show a feature that was just launched recently for all the developers out there, which is called Apex Tail. So Apex Tail is cool because that log file that you know and love so well. All right, so let's do clear, and then let's go find. Oh, it's doing okay. So SFDX Force, Apex. I forget the actual. Is it just Apex Tail, Dave? So Dave Carroll, everyone, product manager for Salesforce DX CLI. So minus H would be good to know, because that's how you get help. So log tail, there we go. :log, :tail. All right, so now that just opens up a tail. And so anything, oh, that's interesting. Traced entity ID. Am I running tail somewhere else? That's kind of what it sounds like to me. All right, well, that didn't work clearly. And I'm out of time, so I want to thank you very much for coming. I hope that all of you have enjoyed this talk, that you feel a bit inspired maybe to go and learn more about the command line. So I'm going to post my slides. My slide share is just Chittum. And I will tweet some links as well, so you can go and learn how to use the command line, because I think it should be accessible to anybody. Thank you very much. Hey.